hopefully I've got the audio set up correctly this time. I tried to do this once before and I actually had two microphones recording and it was terrible. So as you can see now, hopefully for those who are watching the video of this, you can see I have a new mic and hopefully it is the only one recording. But anyway, welcome to the actual first podcast of the Artisan philosophy. The first podcast I placed up was just for testing and also to get the podcast approved through iTunes. So this is the actual first podcast, and what I hope to do is have the podcast available in two formats for those who care. One is simply just a podcast on iTunes, and you can find that if you search the Artisan philosophy. And also on gunsandgearvids.com, there will be a podcast tool in the toolbar. In the menu bar, there will be a podcast menu item. And I want to invite others who would like to place their podcast there. I do not mind hosting your podcast, and I'll do it for free. I won't charge you, and it'll be a place where you can host your podcast and link to it through iTunes so that you don't have to pay for a hosting company to do that. So that's an offer I want to make to all of my friends at gunsandgearvids.com and gun channels and Every Second Matters and all of those good people. So getting right into it, I thought I would do some reloading or hand loading. I love the 410, and I thought I would just do some of that while I was talking. If I can, it may not work out, and I may just have to do the podcast by itself. If so, that'll work out okay. But I really wanted to have a video to go along with it. So in any event, where do I start? I started writing this book about 5 years ago, and basically it started out as a list of best practices for my construction company. And I was going to sit down and list all of the things that I do and the methods that I use to do them, and I would share them with my customers. And honestly, in some cases, if they didn't like them, I wouldn't do the project. So, for example, and this is not arrogance. It's just let me back up. For example, vinyl siding. There's some materials that we just don't think are good materials. So, in a nutshell, I was going to come up with a list of means and methods for construction. Another example would be concrete poured walls in lieu of concrete block construction, because concrete block is inferior. And for those of you watching on the video, it's probably comical because I'm trying to dip out 2 or 3 little grains at a time or flakes at a time. And I need a funnel. I had a funnel, and when we moved the shop, I lost it. So anyway, I'm putting 15 grains for those who are not watching the video. I'm putting 15 grains of our Hodgdon H110, and I'm relatively new to hand loading, so anybody who wants to give advice in the comments, there's nothing I can do to stop you. So anyway, getting back to the Artisan philosophy, what it turned out to be was not just a list of best practices. It turned out to be sort of like all of a philosophy, because it was like my life story. Why am I doing this? How did I get to this point? And all that stuff. And so I said, well, I should just write a book and people can read it and I don't have to explain it every time I talk to somebody. And that's kind of how the artisan philosophy was born. You know, obviously, when I started writing the book, I had to sort of give a history of myself, and which, in a nutshell, again, I don't want to bore you too much with this stuff, but I started out, I mean, basically my entire life wanting to build things, even when I was a child. You know, I played with Legos, not Legos. We had Lincoln logs. I did later play with Legos, but I always liked the real wood of Lincoln logs. You know, so and we had Tonka. You know, we had real metal trucks, toy trucks when I was a kid to play with, and 14.6. And so we had the, you know, pretty heavy duty toys. If y'all see me load one twice, tell me. That's not a good idea, is it, to be talking and loading at the same time? So anyway, when I got into high school, I keep wanting to reach for the lead, but I'm going to load all the powder first. When I got into high school, it was this program, 15 right on the money. Look at that. Perfect. So when I got into high school, we had a vocational, back in those days, I went, what was it, 1977 through 80, we had vocational schools, but there was a limited number of people who could get in because this one vocational school was trying to serve, you know, 4 or 5 schools in the area. So we had to actually draw straws, and that's a bit much. To get from my high school, there was only five or six people that could go, and we drew straws, and I got in. And of course, later in the podcast, later in the series, I'll talk about, you know, spirituality, and that may get some people, you know, it may drive some people off, but it's not going to be what you think, so trust me. But I'm not going to talk about it in this episode. So I'll spare you. But anyway, I thought it was divine intervention that I got in. Let's just put it that way. Okay. I think I get five lead balls. 3, 4, 5. Yep. So I got in, and we actually built homes. We built 2 homes in the 2 years. So it was a really good experience, on the job training. And I was basically the head of, you know, top of my class. I'm not gonna lie. Yeah, I think 6 is too many. Dang it. And so after I got out, I had job offers from, you know, builders. And went to work right away, and it was not long after that to where I was actually my own subcontractor. And now I'm realizing this is a bad idea. I may just take a break from this. So anyway, I was trying to give you a brief history of myself, and it's not a good idea to be doing that on the podcast and hand loading, so I may pick another thing to do next time in the video. And I know you're all out there screaming, "You're right, ArtisanTony, it's crazy, what are you doing? You need to concentrate on what you're doing." Also, I need to keep this powder covered when I'm not talking. So anyway, in a nutshell, my goal for the first podcast was to give you a brief history of me, and you know, right after I spent a few years being a self-employed subcontractor framing for developers in Chattanooga, and at some point, and again here comes my spirituality. At some point, I felt like I needed to give back, and I started getting involved with people, a local group, who were wanting to start a Habitat for Humanity chapter here in Chattanooga. And I was actually lucky enough to be a part of the group that started Habitat in Chattanooga. And I went down to Americus, Georgia, and spent a week there and met Millard Fuller and all that. This was back in 1985, I'm thinking, 86, because it took us several years to get it started. And so the first couple of years after we started Habitat, I was the construction coordinator and the volunteer coordinator, and we all planned on just being interim. We had an interim president, and I was the construction and volunteer coordinator, and we had other people, and we had a board and all that. And shortly after that, I became involved with different, and I guess I shouldn't go through my entire career. I'm just trying to give you an early, sense of, my early life. I spent several years with several nonprofits, Inner City Ministries, Chattanooga Neighborhood Enterprise, which was an organization that gave low interest loans to people who could not get typical loans, and unfortunately some of those loans became part of the housing bubble years later. Anyway, there's so many long stories, it's hard to give us a brief history of yourself. The main thing is, after I spent those early years with the nonprofits, I realized that you can only help people so much before they help themselves, and I wanted to move into more of I wanted to get into architecture, and so I spent the next 7 to 10 years working in architecture and learning about construction documents, drawing, doing drawings, and for even civil engineers, structural engineers. Where's my wands? Here we go, my caps, my shot. And we did a lot of large projects. I was lucky enough, one of the architects I worked for was Brian Toon. He had a lot of contacts with the IBM and different companies, and we ended up doing some large data centers. Like, one of the cool things we did was we got to do a data center for Williams-Sonoma out in San Francisco, and I got to go out and basically do the drawing work, and I was like the grunt guy. I did the drawing work, and they would sign off on it. And so spent 7 to 10 years working for different engineers and architects, and so I got that experience as a project manager. I actually became an associate. I had worked my way up, and my next level at Toon Design Architecture was someday to become a partner, and I was getting close, I felt. But then I kind of felt like this calling to start my own business, and that was about 14 years ago. I started Artisan Construction and have been really happy ever since, and have been lucky enough to work on some really nice projects in Chattanooga, really nice custom homes. And like I said, when I started, I wanted to have this list of best practices that we would tell our customers up front. This is how we do things. And I'm going to move you over here to the drill press. So get ready to crimp these things. Put the roll crimper on them. And I'm going to use some of this. I haven't tried this yet, but I'm going to try this on the crimper. See if it'll help. Because I haven't had a lot of success. I had a little. They're crimping. They're just not very pretty. my crimping skills aren't. This is something that you have to kind of figure out as you're going. And I'm going to take my headphones off finally because I just realized I don't need them all that time. I've been wearing headphones. So see if I can do this without getting in your way. Those on the podcast, this will just be another 10 seconds of crimping. So anyway, what's interesting is, like recently I made some videos making some suggestions on a lady named April Wilkerson, and I didn't know how popular she was. I just, I look at everybody's equals. I don't think anybody's better than me, or I don't think I'm better than them. I think we're all, as humans, we're all equals. So I don't think those are going to come out. Like my little block, I made this out of a 2x2, and I just got it so that now this will come up like that. And my loaded shells, I'm just going to put these in this jar for right now. And then I'll take this and put it upside down. Load me 5 more. That'll be interesting to see what those loads do at the range after being part of a podcast. Probably no telling. I just set that back on there. I made a video about April's carport, and I was just saying, I like her videos, I like her, but this is how I would have built it. And really, there's a lot of people on YouTube who just assume you're just, a Yahoo. I do come across kind of as a Yahoo, I guess. But, I've got almost 40 years. I started in 1977. And really earlier than that, if you count the summer jobs that I worked while I was in high school and even in junior high. So I was an apprentice long before I had ever gone to my vocational school in high school. So, it's hard to sit and describe to people your experience. So I got a lot of negative comments on those videos. But anyway, how do I round out this podcast? Basically, what I'm going to be doing is going through. Let me scroll up to my outline here, and I'm going to be talking about the principles, and the virtues that I developed that I feel like that an artisan should have. And they're in here somewhere. This is if you're seeing on the screen, you're seeing my book scroll by. So the virtues that I came up with were creativity, prudence, objectivity, morality, wisdom, integrity, craftsmanship, performance, and trustworthiness. So I wanted to develop this sort of moral outline, ethical outline for my company and myself. And I've always taught my kids that you need to develop a set of standards for your life and live by them, and don't bend them unless you just unless you learn something new, or you feel like that you've matured, and maybe things that you thought earlier in life were not necessarily true. And I've done that, especially with religion, and I'll have my next podcast may just go into that and get that sort of out of the way. It's not a named religion necessarily. It's more of an ethical code and a respect for the earth and the things that I feel like that have been created for us. And so that's getting into it a little bit too, more than I wanted to on this podcast. But I just was trying to go over, the different things I'll be going through in the podcast. And I'll be going through things like, here's another guilds and societies. So I'll go into the actually what I think is the history of the artisan, how they got started, how we got started. The the manly tool race is the sort of like an arms race, and then I talk about business concepts, contracts even, and all these things can be applied to different types of businesses and different areas of your life. You don't have to be an artisan is not necessarily a contractor. It's someone who is the best in their field, who's reached the pinnacle of their industry and is a leader in their industry, and then has committed to mentoring young people and bringing them up with the same philosophy. And that gets into the sort of the heart of the whole thing. I'll talk about design concepts, the golden section, nature and the design connection, wood, stone, concrete, steel. And then the last thing I'll go through, and this, who knows how many podcasts, is apprenticeships and mentoring. And then, of course, my challenge to society. That's just sort of an outline for my book. But I'll be trying to hit each of those in my podcast. And so I hope you will follow it. And maybe I'll pick something smarter to do besides hand loading in the next podcast for those who want to watch the video. And I might even go back and check those loads just to make sure I don't blow my 410 up when I go to the range next. I want to say thank you to those who watched the video and listened to the podcast. I hope you'll continue to do that. Thanks a lot.